what we'll go through now is the any works in progress or any questions that were in the VIP section. Yeah, when you flatten them, they always look very interesting emotions. So I think what we'll do is we'll answer this question. So some feedback and tips on how to move forward from here with the new concept. Done with blackout and just searching ways to do each step. For example, the shoulder arm, I was just watching your rough to super clean hard surface. I guess the next steps will need to find a good way for cloth stuff like wrinkles and details and surfaces. So just like to get general direction on how to progress. Right, so the stage that you're at, I'd say, is basically this is somewhat of a block out or a concept. So you're looking to refine each one of the elements. So just really confirm that all these pieces are matching your concept first. So I think they're pretty close. You maybe just want to change a couple of the silhouettes. And it's up to you really. So with this character, there's a lot of hanging drapery. So it might be an idea to simulate that in Marvelous Design and then bring it over instead of like sculpting all the individual pieces here. Where I would probably take a bit more of a sculpted approach is on the hood, because that's going to be very important, and the simulation on the hood doesn't work that well. So kind of like simulate these hanging pieces and then you would sculpt the top hood, or personally I would sculpt the top hood. So that would involve just like your normal brushes, like mostly the standard brush and the damn standard. So more specifically for your next steps, what I would do is I'd probably do the hard surface elements first, because obviously they're going to be the less adaptable in comparison to the cloth. So for example, make the hard surface sections right now, like the silhouette, and then start to simulate all the cloths and worry about the cloth second. Everything else is at a good stage so we can see the fingers and stuff. You're just going to slowly introduce more detail at every resolution basically. So usually the way I like to take it is look at the thing that is looking the worst and then attack that section. So you're just slowly bringing everything up to level one at a time, and in that way, you know, it's a more of an iterative process and nothing's left behind. So yeah, that's the sort of workflow I would go with. I think deep down you probably know the workflow. It's just like getting the confidence to understand which one to move on to next. Okay, so unless there's any more questions there, let's go into the works in progress. Do you use 3D wrap workflow, the love hearts, where when you wrap scan detail onto your models? I do, yeah. So we do. It's kind of like a more complicated workflow, maybe for later. But yeah, so for any sort of retopology task, we use a base mesh, 3D wrap that onto a different character. So we already have that topology and we put it onto another one. So that's really important because we use different technologies. So like wrinkle maps, they need to be identically pasted onto one UV. So we need to have that replicated on every single asset. And that's where 3D wrap comes in, or wrap 3D. So yeah, we get a lot of use out of that. Okay, so for anyone here, is there a specific feedback you want me to give you? Otherwise, I'll just go for people on the replays, basically. Yeah, it's a good question about wrap. So that's going to be a software that's going to be useful. It's going to be impressive, and something you could definitely add to your portfolio to like increase your chances of getting a higher skill job for that. Hippo. Okay, let's do the hippo. So yeah, and also to remember, by the time you've learned it, the software changes so much. There might be a different software that's instead of wrap. Maybe it's the Blender starts to bring something out that's easier, or maybe even Unreal Engine. You know, they start to encompass everything. In fact, I think there is. I think there is already where you can sort of wrap new and warp things back on, or they might be in the experimental phases. Okay, cool. Yeah, so this is progressing well. It's nice to see, you know, this is what you classically see with a good workflow, you know, nicely laid out, and then we do our iterations, so like the block out phase, and now you've come to more details and like layering different shades, which is always nice to see. So I think the hyperlight we've done, certainly fixed but constraints. So, okay, yeah, you're ready to move on to retopology and unwrapping. That's really good. And any tips? So before I look into this, usually what I suggest, because obviously I want you guys to just like achieve so much in such a short time. Sometimes people spend a lot of time on the high poly, and you know, like it's towards the end and it gets harder and harder and it takes up more time and there's less progress that's made. So I don't want to sort of like over feedback this, but if there's some things you can take and they're like will improve it a lot, then definitely go for it. But also remember, we can get a bit fancy with the workflow. So as long as the whole silhouette's not changing, we can always come back to this and add a little bit more detail and then rebake everything because it's all connected together. So that's something to take into consideration. So I think the last feedback we had was just matching concepts accessories and the sort of garment here a little bit better, because it had that kind of like Kevlar feel to it, like that hardened feel. So first look upon that. Yeah, so it seems you've fixed up sort of like the seams area to make them a bit more bulky. Like it's definitely less puffy, which is nice to see. So the only things I think is basically the surface, just to harden that up a little bit. Now this could be a little bit of an illusion because the surface here, you might have a texture on that. So once you come into substance and put that nice like Kevlar, it might kind of break up that surface. And the thing with Kevlar and really deep height maps and deep normal maps, it's going to hide all your surface information, like all the wobbles and weaves. So sometimes it's good when they're actually quite big and bulky. So to be honest, what I'd really like to see is just like a little bit of a test bake. So you just take this in and sort of do a test bake on a patch. Maybe you could get a little bit of retopology in this area as like a little sample. Take it into Substance Painter, just sort of like bake that, and then just see how all this interacts. So see how the sculpt is interacting with the texture and how that's all looks. So this is our technical and testing phase that we're doing in the middle. That's going to save us a lot of time. So if it's looking good and everything is how you want it to be, then we can go back and go through the whole workflow. So that's sort of like what I would suggest for you next. So I'd like to see like a little bit of testing. But in terms of sculpting, I think I'm liking it. Like this is looking like skin. The only thing is potentially if this is the sort of like hippo character, I understand that their skin is very sort of like rough and hard, and then you've also got to mix that with arms, which is a human thing. So obviously they have human skin, it's very wrinkly and it bends a lot. So depending on your theme, you might want to not have so many little wrinkles there, because that's looking very human-like. Do you know what I mean? So maybe we can just make it a little bit more harder, or have bigger folds, because what that's indicating is that the skin is really thin, sort of like this, whereas the hippo skin is going to be really thick. So you just want to sort of like blur that line just so it sells itself a little bit more. That'd kind of be my suggestion. But yeah, everything else is looking good. You've got some zips here. Potentially what you want to test as well is whether these zips are coming across as you want them to, because it could be that they're too high detail and it's not going to come across as well in the game. So have a test on that. You could also do a test bake and just see. Might be that you just want to make these a lot bigger and bulkier. And if it's a bulkier zip, it kind of suits the theme of the character. He's kind of like stocky and like big sections. Kind of matches the themes of the thumbs, like how stocky and bulky they are. These little things, like they do make a difference sometimes. Just the thematics of art, like just matching sort of like themes and consistencies, and it just looks better sometimes. So that might be a consideration that you want to do. But yeah, I like how this is all broken up. You've got patches to break up any like flat surfaces and stuff like that. The only other thing as well to finish off is maybe you want to consider adding your own little flair to this. So you're following the concept, but maybe there's something that you can think of that will make this look a little bit better. So I don't know if it's sort of like a tattoo or any sort of unique damages or another accessory and things like that. So you're well within your right to do that, because you're making new art and you have creative liberties for like changing and adapting. It's totally fine. Okay, so you can add some things onto there if you really want to sort of like push the boundaries of that. But yeah, good progress. I like how this is coming on, getting it done quite fast as well. Okay, so we've got an écorché struggling with the face right now. We'll have a look at that. If fell asleep. Thanks for the UDIM's explanation. Reason that last 10%. Yeah, it's exactly. So between the last 10% can take up 50% of the time spent on high poly. So I don't know if you've heard like the 80-20 rule. So that's a very common theme, is sort of like 80% of your time converting to 20%. That's a similar metric you've done, like the 10 and the 50. So we always want to be aware of that. Looking at Beyond Good and 2 trailer as a reference for the skin in terms of how it works. Anthropomorphic characters. Yeah, okay, yeah, so look at the games reference. Very good idea. Is there anything similar? I'm not too familiar with Beyond Evil 2. Is that the one with the monkey? Okay, let's clear that. So if there's any other works in progress. Okay, so we covered Layla's in the sort of like UE version. So she'll be at the stage where she's sort of like breaking up the texture sets and deciding if it's like worthy of a game mesh, or if she's kind of going for a more portfolio one. So we've already done that as an example. So hopefully she finds sort of like use out of that. Done the hippo, so your next stages in terms of like implementing feedback or anyone that you can get across there. Let's do the écorché. So I think more specifically you were talking about the face écorché. I guess it depends on your references. So yeah, the reference is going to be interesting because obviously there's not much facial details there. It has a kind of like a woody effect. In terms of proportions, I think the first thing that I can see, basically this concept has a very long sort of like legged look in comparison to sort of like the upper torso. It also takes up quite a lot of screen space, but obviously that's mostly because of the actual cloth itself. So the underlying anatomy is not going to be that important. What is going to be important is basically these lower feet. So the only thing is you've got a slightly different, you've got a human foot here, so obviously change that to as close to the reference and see how that anatomy is going to work. But it could be that you're sort of using this to study anatomy at the same time, so I'll give you some sort of like anatomy feedback for the écorché. So these can be useful research tasks, so really good for like maybe like cadavers, understanding like what muscles are called and where their incision points are going to be and how they're sort of like flowing into each other. It's not so useful for actually creating the character, like sculpting the character. I suggest just doing that, sculpting fat, skin and muscle all at once. So sometimes can be not as easy as you think. So this sometimes can hinder you a little bit more than it can help you. So just be aware of that. But yeah, so in terms of anatomy, I think things are good. You've got forearm twisting here in terms of muscles insertion. Biceps probably a little bit too elongated in this section. Probably want to shorten that a little bit more into the connection down into like tendons. They usually shrink a little bit. What will be interesting, this would help, is you working out the anatomy of that claw. So look at like actual animals and how does that integrate with like the lower leg of a human. So where are the joints, what are the muscles looking like? That's going to be very useful. So you definitely want to do sort of like more of a study on this section. In terms of the face, I'd say, yeah, it's hard to say really, because obviously all the facial features have been like removed in favor of sort of like blankness. I'd say in terms of proportioning, maybe the eyes are lifted and arched a little bit too high to give more of a kind of like softer view. What I'd go for is more of like an angled silhouette. So instead of an open silhouette, which is kind of like happy and welcoming, you just want slightly more anger, almost like the Game of Thrones one. So let's have a look at the concept. Yeah, so you can see it interpreted here, the interpretation. So it's much more angular, almost like a diamond shape, right? It's same from this side. So this entire character is basically comprised of little squares and aggressive cuts. Like if you look at the chin, it's very angular. The same with the top that goes into the horn. We've got some really sharp areas. So back to your concept, we definitely want to introduce that onto your sculpt, right? Ah, great. So we've got more head details here. Yeah, it might be a bit too low resolution, so just introduce more resolution so you can get those sharp corners, and that's definitely what I do. So you can still sculpt quite roughly in a high poly scenario, so you'll just be using a lot of trim and a lot of polish, and you're just going to be forcing the geometry everywhere. So sometimes it's nice to stay low, really useful for faces. But if you've got something that's very angular, just go up to a couple of resolutions and find comfort in that. Also the face just to block out, and the rest of the body is the écorché study. Okay, so we also have Mario. So I know Mario's going to be doing Street Fighter. So it's really cool that you've followed, like, I really liked your Sagat character and stuff, and this new character. You're watching the ZBrush, did a Capcom presentation. Okay, that's interesting. So you're replicating sort of like an industry workflow presented on the summit. That's very cool. So some of the goals, another goal for the project is learning Marvelous Designer, okay, and good hair cards. That's good. So Marvelous Designer and hair cards. Okay, so you've done mobile games, so transferring over to more sort of like high quality AAA. That's the kind of vibe I'm getting. Yeah, really good to pick up these things. The only thing is sometimes it can be hard on the stylistic characters. But I think this is an interesting middle ground because it's definitely using hair cards. Funnily enough, the hair cards aren't that great here. So I reckon you can do a way better job and sort of like impress someone in the process. So what I can see, the artist that's made this, they haven't really adjusted their normal maps very well, and it's kind of giving that like very block hard look. So if this was in Unreal, you'd get some really nice effects. So you've started the approach where it's sort of blocking out the masses, and then the next phase is understanding how you can split this into sections. From what I can see with the hair, it's going to be a nice and easy one. Like all the hair cards look very familiar. You'll be spending most of your time on perfectly positioning those inside of your sculpt. So it's not like we're making like a braid. It's not like there's multiple sections of the hair. So I think this is a good place to start, definitely. Now, the only problem that I see with the sort of like goals that you want to set for yourself is the Marvelous Designer. So Marvelous Designer is like going to be very useful for drapery, whereas doesn't really integrate that well with the stylistic, mid-stylistic characters like we have here. So I think, you know, it looks like you've kind of sculpted it, maybe used a little bit of Marvelous Design potentially down here, not too sure. The only thing is that when we're making game characters, we don't really want too much information around the joints, because this is going to bend and deform, and it's going to look very strange under deformation, like especially for a fighter character, because obviously there's going to be lots of kicks and bends and rotations. The same could be true sort of around this area. You want to sort of rest it a little bit more. But in terms of sculpting, I think it's coming across really well. It seems you put more detail in sculpting like the hair clumps. So for you, is it next stage is basically you're probably moving on to hair cards, like actually making the hair cards themselves. But no, good. I like how this is going. It's always worth upskilling. I always find it a shame when there's like someone who's used to sculpting in ZBrush, or they do toys and then they just sort of stop there. There's so much more that they can sort of like push into like games, real time. So many more opportunities that come from that. I think this is a good sort of progress there. So yeah, good progress, guys. Kind of leads us straight to the end of the sort of hour. Are there any questions, more questions, like questions and answers for your projects? I want to have you so you're ready, set to go forth with confidence on what the sort of like next steps are. Oh, this is the Capcom sculpt. Oh, I see. Okay. Whoa. I've got some feedback for Capcom then. If they, yeah, that's an interesting that they've kind of put the wrinkles on the joints. I really wouldn't suggest that. But yeah, I guess maybe they don't worry too much. I don't know, I'm not too sure. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it takes a bit longer to go into Marvelous Designer. Like if you want, it has to be, the style is so specific with the cloth. It's hard to replicate and control Marvelous Designer in a way that it fits your style. So it's just as easy, or sometimes just as fast to sculpt it. It's kind of one of those backwards thoughts. And you get used to it when you've been doing a couple of more characters. You just suddenly start to think, well, I don't need to make the layout. I don't need to sew it all together, simulate it, export it, I could literally, you know, with the 2 hours, 3 hours I've got, I could just make it now. So, and a little bit more accurate. So definitely with a stylistic character, it's more forgiving. So we've been more specific. And sometimes it's just nice to sculpt cloth. But yeah, for this character, these are very easy to sculpt. It just seems that they might have done a bit of Marvelous Designer. Sometimes a trap that artists fall into is that the simulation will basically simulate around somewhere annoying, like a joint or an ankle. And then because they're so scared to like deviate from that simulation, they just keep it there in fear, and then they don't adjust it later. So sometimes Marvelous Designer can't be the best thing, whereas if you're sculpting it, you're making every single decision. For the animator, for your low poly, for your unwrap, the whole workflow, you're making these decisions. So it's good to get used to. Yeah, folds are difficult, and Marvelous Designer does definitely help. You have to go through the valley of the suck there. You know, when I first started sculpting clothes, I think I was trying to make some jeans and I was redoing it like 5 times or something, and even after the 5th time it didn't look good. The feedback from my peers was sort of like, doesn't look like jeans. So, but each time I got better and better. So it's worth applying. What you can also do is you can also do simulations and then just sort of like copy the elements. Maybe bring it into to ZBrush and overlay it and then sort of like match it. Or you can remove parts of the simulation if it looks a bit crap. So for example, around the knee, you can just soften it, but then the whole thing breaks. So it's definitely things to experience. So yeah, I'll have to watch this Capcom just so I know what sort of path you're on. Is that what sort of jobs are you going for, or what's your sort of dream outcome? It's nice that you basically specialized down already. Cloths and anatomy, here's a video. Yeah, there's some resources where you can sort of study cloth. I can't even remember if I've done one. Let's have a think. Yeah, I've got some Marvelous Designer videos out there on the YouTube, and there's obviously the t-shirt one. I think that done pretty well of like how to break down cloth. The thing with that video on the YouTube is it's very keeping it very simple. Like sometimes people try and overcomplicate the folds, but from what I can see, there's a standardization here. So like we usually think about zigzags, Z's and X's, which is very useful. And again, if there's anything super specific, just come into the VIP and mention it as a question, maybe like at me in it, and then I can put it as a subject for like the following weeks and sort of prepare for it. Basically, the later the suggestions are to the stream, the less time I have to sort of like build something up. So the earlier the better, really. The more sort of detail I can put into it. Not necessarily work for Capcom, just like the characters, they're vibrant and colourful. Yeah, start with something you enjoy and then branch out from that and test some other things. I think that's the best workflow. Okay guys, I'm going to wrap it up there.